It began on the eve of Twelfth night, under a sky swollen with clouds heavy enough to smother the moon. Rain slicked the streets outside my study, drumming against the windows with a hollow insistence. I had been immersed in my work, poring over brittle, centuries-old documents, the scent of mildew clinging to the pages, when I heard the knock at the door. It was a strange hour for visitors, and stranger still when I opened the door to find no one there. The wind swept in sharply, rustling the folds of my robe, and I was about to close the door when I noticed the package on the stoop, a small lacquered box of dark mahogany, perfectly dry despite the storm. I brought it inside, my curiosity outweighing caution. The box was lighter than it appeared, its surface engraved with intricate patterns of interwoven vines. Inside, resting on a bed of deep green velvet, was an invitation. To uncover truths and ancient delights, join us for the 12th night, Wintermere Manor, 8 o'clock sharp. The card was printed in an elaborate script, the letters raised slightly under my fingertips. There was no name, no signature, no explanation. I read the note twice, the phrasing tugging at some obscure corner of my memory. Wintermere Manor, a place I had passed once on a lonely drive, remote and crumbling, its name whispered in the hushed tones reserved for places people avoided. I told myself it was absurd to consider going. The idea was ridiculous, an anonymous invitation to an unknown gathering at a place soaked in dark rumors. And yet, as the evening wore on, the card seemed to exert a strange pull. The phrasing nagged at me, the mention of truths stirring something dormant. When the clock struck 7, I made my decision. I told myself it was for research, for the possibility of encountering a fragment of history hidden within the manor's decaying walls. But as I donned my overcoat and braced myself against the storm, the truth settled uneasily in my chest. I was lonely. My quiet life of archives and solitude had left a hollow that curiosity alone could not explain away. The road to Wintermere was treacherous. The rain made visibility poor, and the woods that bordered the estate seemed to lean closer as I drove, their skeletal branches scratching at the darkened sky. When the manor finally loomed into view, I was struck by its oppressive presence. Its facade, though once grand, had been eroded by time, and the flickering lanterns hanging from its gate cast distorted shadows that danced like specters. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand hovering over the iron knocker, shaped like a snarling beast. Before I could strike it, the door creaked open, as if in anticipation. Warmth spilled out into the rain, carrying with it the scent of mulled wine and something faintly metallic. The entry hall was vast and dimly lit, its high ceilings adorned with a grotesque chandelier that seemed more bones than crystal. Other guests mingled in small groups, their cloaks dripping onto the marble floor. They all wore masks, ornate, filigreed creations that glittered in the dim light. A servant approached, pressing a mask into my hands, and though I protested, they insisted. All guests must wear one. The mask was light and cold, a delicate thing that fit too perfectly. Once it was on, I felt different, as though I were stepping into a role I hadn't agreed to play. The ballroom was a study in decadence. Long tables groaned under the weight of golden platters piled high with strange delicacies. Quail eggs painted in silver, fruit glistening like jewels, and pastries shaped like miniature crowns. Violin music hummed through the air, its mournful melody a strange contrast to the festive atmosphere. But something felt wrong. The guests, perhaps 20 in all, moved like actors in a play, their movements deliberate and their laughter too crisp, like a sound practiced rather than genuine. Despite the jovial mask of celebration, a current of unease wound through the room, subtle but persistent. I stayed to the edges, observing. Occasionally, I caught snippets of conversation, voices that seemed oddly mismatched to their masks. Some spoke in lilting accents long out of fashion. Others used words that hadn't graced the English language in centuries. It was then I noticed him, a figure standing apart from the revelers, his mask plainer than the rest, but his presence impossible to ignore. He was tall and thin, his posture rigid as if the air around him resisted his very being. His eyes, cold and pale, bored into mine from across the room, holding me in place like a predator sizing up its prey. I turned away, breaking his gaze, but when I looked back, he was gone. Later, as the clock in the hall struck 11, a ripple passed through the crowd. The laughter quieted, the music softened, and the guests turned their attention toward the far end of the room. There, in front of a tall archway shrouded in velvet curtains, the stranger reappeared. He held something in his hands, a mask unlike any I had seen, its surface carved with runes and symbols that seemed to shift under the light. "Friends," he began, his voice like gravel on glass. "The hour draws near. Tonight, we honor a tradition as old as time itself, a gathering of seekers bound by fate to uncover the truths that lie beyond the veil." A murmur of excitement ran through the crowd, but I felt only dread. The room grew colder, the air heavy with expectation. The stranger's eyes found mine again, and his lips twisted into a faint smile. "Shall we begin?" The velvet curtains parted, as though commanded by an unseen force, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase that descended into darkness. The stranger stepped aside, extending an arm toward the passage, as if issuing a silent invitation. One by one, the masked guests moved forward, their murmurs soft but brimming with anticipation. I hesitated at the back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But the door to the manor was far behind, and the stranger's pale eyes seemed to pin me in place. "After you," a woman in an elaborate peacock mask said softly, her voice tinged with amusement as she gestured toward the stairs. Swallowing my fear, I joined the line of guests as we descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the flickering light from the sconces along the walls cast grotesque shadows that swayed and shifted like living things. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a cavernous chamber that took my breath away. The walls were made of dark stone, slick with moisture, and massive pillars rose into the gloom above, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed older than the manor itself. The air smelled faintly of earth and something coppery, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface inlaid with black marble and adorned with strange, twisting patterns. Surrounding it were more guests, their masks glinting in the dim torchlight as they formed a loose circle. At the head of the altar was the stranger, his presence more commanding here than it had been in the ballroom. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber. "You have all come seeking something: truth, power, salvation. Tonight, you shall witness the bridge between our world and the beyond, but only one among you shall be chosen to cross it." The words sent a ripple of unease through the group. For the first time, I noticed how still the guests had become, their excitement now tempered with something darker. Fear, or perhaps grim resignation. The stranger raised the ornate mask he had shown us earlier. Its surface shimmered as though alive, the runes carved into it, pulsating faintly in time with an unseen rhythm. "This mask," he continued, "is the key. It will open the door between realms, but for it to work, it must have a willing participant, someone who dares to face the truths that lie beyond." A murmur of confusion swept through the group. The stranger's gaze swept the room, lingering on each guest in turn. When his eyes landed on me, a cold dread settled deep in my chest. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Step forward." The crowd turned to me as if pulled by invisible strings, their expressions obscured by their masks, but their collective gaze heavy and oppressive. My throat felt dry, my legs leaden. I don't understand, I stammered. Why me? The stranger's lips curled into a faint smile. Because you are new to this dance, untainted. You will not resist the truth as the others might. The murmurs grew louder now, a chorus of whispers that filled the chamber. I turned to the other guests, hoping for an ally, but their eyes glinted coldly behind their masks. There was no sympathy, no camaraderie, only a shared anticipation for what would happen next. The stranger extended the mask toward me, its surface glowing faintly. For a moment, I considered running, but where would I go? The staircase had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. This is madness, I whispered, but my feet betrayed me, carrying me forward toward the altar. As my hands closed around the mask, a jolt of cold shot up my arms, like ice burrowing under my skin. The runes on its surface flared brighter, their glow filling the chamber with an eerie light. Place it on your face, the stranger commanded. I hesitated, every instinct in me screaming to stop, but the crowd's expectant silence, the stranger's unyielding gaze, and the thrumming power of the mask made resistance impossible. Slowly, I raised it to my face. The moment the mask touched my skin, the world shattered. A deafening roar filled my ears, and the chamber dissolved around me, replaced by a void of swirling darkness. Shapes moved in the distance, shifting, writhing forms that defied logic or reason. Whispers filled the void, growing louder and louder until they became a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. And then I saw them, faces, hundreds of them, their features twisted and warped with agony, their eyes hollow and accusing. They pressed closer, their mouths moving in silent screams. Each one carried a terrible familiarity. Faces I'd seen in the ballroom, their masks gone to reveal the truth beneath. "What is this?" I cried, my voice swallowed by the void. "This is the beyond," the stranger's voice answered, though his figure was nowhere to be seen. "And you, Edward, have been chosen to join it." The faces surged closer, their skeletal hands reaching for me. The mask burned against my skin, its runes searing into my flesh as the voices turned into a single, unified cry. "Stay with us!" I wrenched the mask from my face and fell to the cold stone floor of the chamber, gasping for air. Around me, the crowd stared in silence, their masks hiding their expressions. But in the stranger's pale eyes, I saw only triumph. "Welcome to the truth," he said softly. The mask clattered to the ground, its glow dimming as the chamber's flickering torchlight returned. My chest heaved as I knelt on the cold stone, my limbs trembling, the burn of the runes still etched into my skin. Around me, the masked figures stood motionless, their silence oppressive. The stranger loomed above me, his pale eyes glinting with something that chilled me to the marrow. Satisfaction. "You have seen," he intoned, "and you have returned. The door is open now, Edward. There is no turning back." I staggered to my feet, the weight of his words sinking into me like lead. What have you done?" My voice echoed through the chamber, weak and trembling. He tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. "I have shown you what lies beyond the veil. You have touched the truth, and now it clings to you. Do you feel it? The whispers at the edge of your mind, the shadows that ripple where none should be." As if summoned by his words, the air around me thickened, the faint murmur of whispers growing louder. I turned wildly, searching for the source, but the sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. The other guests began to move, their masks glinting in the torchlight as they tightened the circle around me. I backed away instinctively, my heart hammering. There was no escape. "Let me go," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I never agreed to this." The stranger chuckled, a low and hollow sound. You agreed the moment you accepted the invitation, the moment you stepped through the doors of Wintermere Manor. Your fate was sealed. I felt the cold press of the altar behind me, and the weight of the crowd closing in. Their movements were synchronized, almost mechanical, as if they were being guided by an unseen force. Panic clawed at me. "Stay back," I warned, though the fear in my voice betrayed my desperation. No one listened. The whispers grew louder still, forming half-coherent phrases that curled around my ears like serpents. "Take your place. Open the gate. Stay with us." The runes on the discarded mask flared briefly, casting strange, twisting shadows that danced across the chamber walls. And then, something shifted. The torches flickered violently, their flames bending as if drawn toward the altar. The air turned icy, and the shadows lengthened, converging on a point near the center of the room. From the darkness emerged a form, not solid, but writhing, its shape impossible to fully comprehend. Tendrils of black mist stretched from its core, reaching toward the crowd like grasping fingers. A collective gasp rippled through the group, and for the first time, I saw fear in their masked faces. Even the stranger's composure faltered, his pale eyes narrowing as he took a step back. "This was not meant to happen," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. I didn't need to be told twice. Seizing the distraction, I darted past the nearest guests, shoving through the disoriented crowd, as the thing in the center of the chamber began to expand. Its tendrils lashed out, striking the walls with a force that sent tremors through the floor. Behind me, chaos erupted. The whispers became screams as the guests scrambled to flee, their elegant masks slipping askew in their panic. The stranger's voice rose above the din, sharp and commanding, as he shouted words in a language I didn't recognize. I didn't stop to listen. The staircase that had vanished earlier now yawned open, its spiraling steps illuminated by the flickering glow of the torches. Without hesitation, I bolted toward it, the chill of the chamber biting at my heels. As I ascended, the screams grew fainter, swallowed by the roaring cacophony emanating from the thing below. My lungs burned with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, the shadows seemed to writhe and stretch, reaching for me like living things. When I burst through the door at the top of the stairs, I found myself back in the manor's entry hall. The ballroom was deserted now, the revelry replaced by a suffocating silence. The chandeliers above swayed gently, their crystals chiming faintly in the still air. But I wasn't alone. The stranger stood by the main door, his back to me. He turned slowly as I approached, his pale eyes gleaming with something cold and unreadable. "You cannot leave," he said softly. "The manor will not allow it, not until the ritual is complete." I didn't answer. My only thought was escape. With a burst of adrenaline, I sprinted toward the door, my hand closing around the cold iron handle. To my relief, it gave way under my grip, the door creaking open to reveal the stormy night beyond. But as I stepped outside, the air around me thickened, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The manor loomed larger now, its windows dark and empty like soulless eyes. The trees in the distance swayed unnaturally, their skeletal branches twisting toward the sky. And then I heard it, a deep, resonant voice, not the stranger's, but something far older, speaking directly into my mind. "You cannot run from the truth, Edward. It is part of you now." The whispers returned, louder than ever, and I stumbled forward into the storm, the manor's shadow pressing against my back. I knew then that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. I staggered into the storm, the cold rain mingling with sweat on my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps, and though the open countryside stretched before me, I felt no relief. The shadows clinging to Wintermere Manor loomed in the corner of my vision, dark and watchful. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as though unseen hands clawed at my ankles. I glanced back once. The manor was almost obscured by the curtain of rain, its silhouette warped and menacing. Yet even at this distance, I could see a faint glow emanating from its windows, a sickly light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Run, I told myself, though the command felt futile. The forest swallowed me as I pressed forward, the towering trees bending low like mourners at a funeral. Their branches scratched at my face and tugged at my clothes, but I didn't stop. My footfalls echoed against the sodden earth, and with each step, I became more acutely aware of the sound following me. A second set of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. Instead, I pushed deeper into the woods, the whispering wind carrying fragments of voices that sent chills skittering down my spine. Truth cannot escape. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, the impact jarring the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there, my face pressed against the damp earth, the metallic taste of blood on my tongue. And then I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against leaves. It came from somewhere close, too close. My heart thundered in my chest as I forced myself onto my hands and knees, squinting into the rain-soaked darkness. A figure emerged. It was the stranger, his mask gone, but his face still obscured by shadows. His pale eyes gleamed like distant lanterns, fixed on me with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. "You cannot flee what you have become," he said, his voice low and resonant, each word sharp as a knife. "I didn't ask for this," I spat, my voice trembling. "I never wanted any of it." He stepped closer, his movements unnaturally smooth, as though the very air bent to accommodate him. "It does not matter. You opened the door. You gazed into the beyond, and now it gazes back. You belong to it, Edward." "No." The word came out as a whisper, more plea than denial. The whispers rose again, a discordant symphony that swirled around me. Images flickered in my mind, faces from the beyond, twisted and anguished, their hollow eyes pleading for release. They reached for me, their skeletal hands grasping, their mouths forming soundless cries. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the stranger. "Leave me alone!" He tilted his head, almost curiously. "It is not I you should fear." The ground beneath me shuddered, and I stumbled. The forest around us twisted, the trees contorting into grotesque shapes. Their branches stretched toward the sky, forming jagged arches that pulsed with the same sickly light as the manor. And then, the darkness broke. The forest fell away, replaced by an infinite void filled with writhing shadows. The whispers surged into screams, and from the blackness emerged the shapes I had seen while wearing the mask. Their bodies were vague, shifting, but their faces, were vivid with suffering. I turned to flee, but the void stretched endlessly in every direction. The stranger stood motionless, his pale eyes locked on mine as the figures advanced, their whispers coalescing into a single, chilling phrase. "Stay with us." They reached for me, their hands cold and unyielding as they brushed against my skin. My strength ebbed, a heavy fatigue dragging me to my knees. It felt as though my very soul was being siphoned, pulled toward the writhing mass. In my despair, the stranger's voice cut through the chaos. "Do you wish to survive, Edward?" I looked up, my vision blurred with tears. "Yes," I choked. "I'll do anything." He extended a hand, his expression unreadable. "Then make the exchange. Choose another to take your place. Only then can you escape the grasp of the beyond." His words sent a fresh wave of horror through me. My mind raced, grappling with the implications. Sacrifice someone else? Condemn another to this nightmare? The whispers grew louder, the figures closing in, Their hollow eyes seemed to see into me, through me, as if they knew my thoughts. "No," I whispered, though the word trembled with uncertainty. The stranger lowered his hand. "Then you will remain." The shadow surged forward, and I screamed, and woke on the wet ground, the forest eerily silent. The rain had stopped, and the manor was gone, as though it had never been. I stumbled back to the village, my mind fractured and raw. For days I wandered in a haze, haunted by whispers only I could hear, shadows only I could see. And then, one day, an ornate box appeared on my doorstep, an invitation inside. This time, I understood its meaning. It was my turn to send it.